What is up, Wapham crew? Welcome. I'm so grateful that you are here this evening. I'm your host, TessaTNT, and we are live from the Mile High Clubhouse tonight. Secure your tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the Rockies on a rocky mountain high, get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners, and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in colorful Colorado. It is Sunday, October 3rd, Monday, October 4th for those of you across the pond and beyond. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you. And welcome to We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I hope you had an awesome weekend so far. Thank you so much again for joining us tonight on one of our many outlets. If you're listening live right now, you're listening on Spreaker.com. You can also find us live on KPNL Radio, which you can find at kpnl-db.com. You can also follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, CastBox, Tumblr, SoundCloud, TuneIn Radio, Deezer, Podcast Addict, and Podcast Chaser. Make sure you like and follow us on YouTube. Ding that little bell on there. That way, anytime we have a new episode come out, you can get notifications for that. Like and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and StreamYard. So tonight, it is story time with me, TessaTNT. And I hope you guys like strange and otherworldly stories. This book is 50 Strange Stories of the Supernatural, True Accounts of Weird and Otherworldly Happenings, and it's edited by Mr. John Canning. Phantom sailors and ships. The sailor has always been the most superstitious of men, isolated by great stretches of ocean for months at a time from his fellow men ashore. He remains more unsophisticated than the soldier, even in these days of vastly improved communications, and far more than the soldier or the landsman, he is a prey to the sky influences of legend and hearsay. In the days before the blessing of electric light, he lived through his night watches in a world of illusory shadows and flickering lanterns. His eyes misled by sea mist and moon ray. Anything could happen at sea, however fearful or miraculous. Jack might be terrified, but he was never wholly surprised by Phantom Hulk, long-dead pirate, monster, mermaid, or possibly, most horrible of all, the apparition of a drowned messmate in his hammock. Whatever fears he suffered would all be repaid by the breathless interest of shore audiences when he spun his yarns in a Portsmouth tavern, perhaps adding a few colorful details which might earn him an extra pot of porter or pipe full of baccy from some sensation-hungry landlubber. But even allowing for superstition and imagination, there are countless stories of strange appearances at sea which have been seen by whole crews at a time and by different ships on different occasions. Phantom sailors and the ghosts of their vessels seem to outlive land wraiths, remaining as active in the days of steam as in those of sail. The theory has been advanced that the gradual fading of familiar specters ashore is due to the glare of electricity in which the frail shadows cannot survive. On the dark surface of the sea, conditions are most favorable. This may explain the apparently endless voyage of the most famous of all sea specters, the Flying Dutchman. For some 300 years, Cornelius Vanderdecken has been afloat, ever since that day in the 17th century when he set sail for Holland from Batavia. Captain Vanderdecken had the reputation of being as merciless to his ship as he was to his men, pushing her on through storms and turbulent seas that would have deterred a more reasonable skipper. He had also a name for godlessness and blasphemy. On this particular fateful voyage, his ship ran into violent headwinds when she reached the Cape of Good Hope. For 9 weeks, Vanderdecken and his weary crew urged her on, but in vain. Understandably enough, it is said, Vanderdecken's patience gave way. He fell to his knees on the deck and cursed God, swearing a terrible oath that he would round the Cape if it took him till Judgment Day. And then followed a sequence of events which have since become legend. As if unseen powers had heard him, the winds rose higher. Vanderdecken's shrieked curses rose above their howl as he tramped the deck, shouting snatches of a blasphemous song. Suddenly, from the blackness of the night, a brilliant light shone out and formed itself into a dazzling figure, which floated down until it rested on the poop of the ship. The sailors knelt and prayed, some taking it for an angel, others for the Holy Ghost, but Vanderdecken stood his ground, not even bothering to remove his hat, and to the gentle salutation of the visitation replied with a volley of curses. The figure stood unmoved, and Vanderdecken then did something which paralyzed his crew with horror. He drew his pistol and fired at the spirit, ordering it to leave his ship at once. The bullet made no impression on it. Then it spoke. Captain Vanderdecken, you have taken an oath to sail until Judgment Day, if need be. For your blasphemies you shall do so. You shall neither eat, drink, nor sleep, nor ever see your home port again. But sail the 7 seas, a portent of disaster to all who see you. God is not mocked, Captain Vanderdeck. And so it is that ever since the night seamen had shuddered and crossed themselves at the sight of a phantom vessel rising from the waves, topmasts first, in the waters round Cape Horn and the Cape of Good Hope, or even farther south. Accounts of her appearance differ. Sometimes she seems like a sloop or a schooner. The Back Shanty, sailing in 1881 between Melbourne and Sydney, saw her as a brig. Aboard the Back Shanty was a young man who was to be King George V, and he, among others, saw the sight as recorded in the ship's log. The Flying Dutchman crossed our bows, a strange red light as of a phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which light masts, spars, and sails of a brig 200 yards distant stood up in strong relief. On arriving there, no vestige nor any sign whatever of any material ship was to be seen either near or right away to the horizon. The night being clear and the sea calm, 13 persons altogether saw her. One of the persons, the sailor who had first sighted her, fell from the fore-topmast cross-trees to his death on the deck, and at the next port the admiral who had been aboard the Back Shanty became fatally ill. The curse of the Dutchman still had power. The phantom was said to have appeared in 1911 to a whaler, the Orkney Belle, off Reykjavik, her sails swelling in a non-existent breeze, her bows almost ramming the side of the real vessel. Then from her depths 3 bells sounded, and heeling to starboard she drifted away. There is no record that disaster followed this appearance. Another Dutchman who still wanders the seas is Captain Bernard Folk, also of Vanderdecken's time. He was a brilliant navigator with a bad reputation, reputedly in league with the devil. When his ship vanished, it was said that he had been condemned by his master to sail forever. But a sight of him does not automatically bring misfortune. His legend, and that of the 2 Walleran brothers of Falkenberg Castle in Lower Lorraine, have become inextricably mixed with that of Vanderdecken. The waters of the Solway sometimes carry ghostly longships, the dragon-prowed galleys of the days when Danish readers were the terror of the seas. 2 of these, which sank at their moorings, taking all hands down with them, have been seen on light nights, and a venturesome little boat which went out to investigate them about the turn of the 18th century was caught up in the whirl of waters as the galley sank from sight and vanished with them. Today, nobody cares to take too close a look at those warrior-laden ships when they still appear. Another ghost of the Solway is a shallop sunk out of spite by a rival ferryman as it bore a young bride and bridegroom and their attendants across the bay. The man who wrecked it is still aboard in skeleton form, and like Vanderdecken, he brings ill luck. A similar story is told of a ghostly bridal party seen off the Goodwin Sands. The Gulf of St. Lawrence between Quebec and Newfoundland is said to be haunted by a British flagship, one of a fleet sent by Queen Anne against the French. She sank under the cliffs of Cap d'Espoir in Gaspé Bay, but every year, on the anniversary of the tragedy, can be seen as a gay vision. Her decks crowded with red-coated soldiers in minter hats, her ports ablaze with light. In the bows stands an officer pointing landwards, one arm round the waist of a pretty girl. Then the lights fade, the vessel tosses, heels over, and vanishes beneath the waves. Hello, Mr. Morris. The coasts of New England are famous, or notorious, for ghost ships. The most terrifying is the Phantom Palatine. When she is seen scudding down Long Island Sound, it is a sign to prepare for storms, hardly supervising in view of her story. The Palatine, a Dutch trader, left Holland in 1752 with a load of immigrants bound for New England. She was not a happy ship. The captain and crew were a drunken, brutal lot who terrorized and robbed their passengers, and their heavy drinking was probably responsible for the ship grounding on Block Island, though the island was the headquarters of wreckers who may well have lured the Palatine with false lights. As she lurched ashore, bands of these human vultures fell on her, seized all they could get in the way of valuables, flung overboard or knifed any passenger who tried to resist, and raped or dragged away any woman who happened to take their fancy. One woman remained, cowering below decks. Some stories call her a young mother whose baby had vanished in the pandemonium. She was driven from her hiding place by a dreadful sound, the crackling of flames. The wreckers had fired the Palatine, having taken from her all they wanted. Now she was drifting out to sea with the wretched survivor aboard. The girl scrambled up to the deck and stood there shrieking for help, the flames mounting behind her. Then the masts crumbled, the deck fell in, and the frantic figure vanished into the blazing inferno. Still in those waters the ship is seen. Still the woman signals desperately for help, and the ship is seen. The Palatine fire lights up the Block Island. But skeptics say that there may be a natural explanation of this light, perhaps phosphorescence. Another burning ship is the Packet Light, wrecked like Queen Anne's flagship in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. She appears first in the form of a ball of fire. Not all sea apparitions are bringers of bad luck. Some, like phantoms on land, seem sent to give help or well-meant warnings. Captain Rogers of the Society was lucky enough to receive such a warning in the year of 1664. That's odd that there's some hiccups in the sound. I just replaced the cord actually for the microphone last night, so it should be working better than before, but I don't know, perhaps it's Spreaker? I'm not quite sure. Dang it. Yeah, I listened to a little bit of last night's show, and I definitely heard some interference going on. Give me a moment. I have someone knocking at my door. Well, that was my daughter, and it appears that they're making Frito chili pies. Unfortunately, I cannot eat while I am reading, but it sounds delightful. Thanks for the heads up, Mr. Morris. Okay, so in the year 1664, the Society was cruising along the east coast of America, bound for Virginia, apparently in no trouble. The captain, thinking all was well, retired. He was deeply asleep when he was roused by a cold touch on his shoulder. "Turn out, Captain, and look about," said a voice. The captain shook himself awake. There was nothing to be seen, but a true sailor, ready to believe the unbelievable, he returned to his cot. A second time, the touch and the warning came, and a second time he investigated without result. The Society was about 300 miles from land. He calculated and could be in no danger of rocks or grounding. But a third warning came. This time the voice said clearly, "Go on deck and cast the lead." The captain obeyed, and found to his horror only 7 fathoms. Hurriedly, he gave orders to anchor. When dawn came, it was seen that the Society lay close inshore, under the capes of Virginia instead of far out at sea. The ghostly visitant had saved her from certain destruction. Another lucky skipper was Joshua Slocum. He was an old professional master mariner who had worked his way up from a deckhand to being master of his own small bark. Teleport you sometime. That would be awesome. If I could teleport you, Mr. Morris, I would. If it continues to be wonky or whatnot, let me know, and I can try switching it over to my Logitech microphone and see if perhaps that works better. I'm not sure. Also try maybe resetting your speaker, but yeah, how odd. Okay, so another lucky skipper was Joshua Slocum. He was an old professional master mariner who had worked his way up from a deckhand to being master of his own small bark. But she had been wrecked, and Slocum was reduced to working for 2 years in a Boston shipyard. Then, in 1892, the captain of a whaler made him a present of a little old sloop called the Spray. She was in poor shape after 7 years lying beached, but Slocum vowed he was going to make her a new keel and ribs, and worked for 13 months until the Spray was as good as new, if not better. Slocum then methodically turned an old dory into a lifeboat, took aboard supplies and equipment, and on July 1st, 1895, put out from Yarmouth, Massachusetts, to sail around the world. It was a lonely venture, even for a man of Slocum's sturdy character. He comforted himself by shouting questions to an imaginary hand as to how the voyage was going, answering himself, "All right, sir, all right, sir." There were human contacts, of course, notably on the island of Fayal in the Azores, where Slocum was given a warm welcome, plenty of fruit, and enormous white cheese. A young woman proposed that, for a small wage, she should accompany him as domestic staff. Slocum politely declined the offer and sailed for Gibraltar. So tempting was the food given to him by the people of Fayal that Slocum spent a whole day doing little else but eating it. Not surprisingly, the prolonged banquet of cheese and plums resulted in agonizing stomach cramps. As Slocum battled with his digestion, the wind began to freshen. Painfully, he crawled up on deck and struggled to get reefs into his sails, doubling up in agony every few moments. Then, having lashed the helm, he somehow got back to his cabin, where he lay writhing on the floor, delirious with pain. At last he fainted. Hello, beautiful Sister Sandra. So great to see you. Okay, so switch it over on music break. Gotcha. So if it is still crackling, like I said, let me know, and I shall do that. All right. When he recovered his senses, the spray was tossing about like a cork. He knew that he would have to take the helm, though in his state it seemed impossible. Once again he struggled on deck. There, to his incredulous amazement, he saw at the helm a tall man, in clothing which seemed unfamiliar. Reassuringly, the stranger swept off his cap with a smile and, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, introduced himself as the pilot of the Pinta, which had set sail for Spain to the New World as part of the fleet of Columbus in August 1492, almost 400 years before Slocum had put to sea. Slocum was to return to his cabin and rest, he said while he guided the spray. Too ill and bemused to think clearly or even consider all this particularly extraordinary, Slocum accepted the offer and asked his helper to stay aboard until next day. As the ghostly pilot returned to his duty, he turned smilingly to Slocum, remarking that it was never wise to mix cheese and plums, or to eat white cheese at all without knowing its origin. And the spray sailed safely on to Gibraltar. A similar experience befell Captain Johansen of Liverpool in 1900. But this time the vessel was sailing from Gibraltar to America. She was Bellotta, a small open sailing boat manned by Johansen and his 14-year-old son. Their daring venture was rewarded by 8 days of calm weather. On the morning of the 8th day, both Johansens were basking in the sunshine, the boy asleep. Suddenly, Captain Johansen heard a voice speaking. Making a remark was his impression. He looked round, but saw nobody except the sleeping boy. It had been imagination, he decided. Then another voice spoke, and more voices, chattering away in a language he did not recognize. The boy woke and listened with his father. Both were amazed, and neither could think of an explanation. 2 days after this strange event, a gale blew up while young Johansen was at the helm. "Let go of the jib sheet," called his father. But the inexperienced boy let go of the tiller in order to obey. The boat at once began to turn beam on to the sea. It was a moment of peril until, as if waiting for their cue, a band of 4 shadowy men materialized. One grasping the tiller and wrenched the little boat back on course. All night he steered her, a strange figure in rough, primitive clothing, with an iron prop where his left leg should have been. He and his companions talked continuously to Johansen, who could not understand a word they said, and showed them great kindness and goodwill. Seeing the Lotta in safe hands, father and son slept. When the sun rose, the spectral crew had vanished. Next night they returned and seemed to signal other craft which the Johansens could not see. Concerned at the possible effect of their weight, if weight they had, in the bow of the tiny Lotta, Johansen sent the boy to tell them to move aft. As he moved towards them, they vanished once more and never returned. Johansen was hard-headed, sober, and skeptical. He recorded the occurrences of 30 and 31 August 1900 as a matter of solid fact. Nearer to our own time was the curious incident that befell a British submarine during the First World War. One of the most popular submarine commanders at the Southeast Coast Depot was Ryan, not his real name, but that given by the recorder of the story in 1919. He was a cheerful, handsome man, distinctive in appearance, popular with everyone, and there was general mourning when his submarine failed to return from one of its routine patrols off the Dutch shoals. Either the Germans had sunk Ryan or an accident had happened, for he should have returned to base in 3 weeks, and 8 passed without news of him. Another submarine set out on the same drill, moving on the surface of the sea by night, submerged by day because of the danger from German aircraft patrols. Proceeding slowly one Sunday morning, she broke surface with her periscope. As the second officer scanned the sea around them, he suddenly turned and cried, "By Jove, there's jolly old Ryan waving to us like mad from the water." The commander instantly gave orders for the submarine to be surfaced, lifelines to be thrown out, and all preparations made for the rescue of their friend who had been so miraculously preserved. Excitement reigned on deck, and they drew near the place where he had been seen, but no trace of him was visible, though only a few had been seen. Only a few minutes had passed. Had he sunk? He had not looked like a drowning man. Indeed, his face had been cheerful and smiling. Had the officer made a mistake? No, he could swear it was Ryan. He had been thinking of Ryan at that moment and translated his thought into vision. Not in the least, he said. The commander gave orders to press on. It was no use searching farther and exposing themselves to danger. Then, just ahead, an object was sighted. As they skirted it carefully, they saw what it was, a pair of mines, right in the path of the submarine that submarine would have taken if Ryan or his spirit had not appeared and made her change of course. A less welcome return by a departed messmate was that of paymaster of the Monongahela, a corvette of the United States Navy and the First World War. The red-bearded, one-eyed Pay was much liked and convivial. Too much so, for it was his fondness for whiskey which eventually caused his death. As he lay dying on board, he said to his brother officers, "Dear boys, you've been good to me, and I love you for it. I've loved the ship too, and I can't bear to think of leaving it. I'll come back if I can, and you'll find me in my cabin, number 2, on the side port." It is a measure of sailors' superstition that cabin number 2 is allowed to remain vacant for 3 cruises. Then a young assistant paymaster joined the ship, and being a man not given to fancies, took possession of number 2 and settled comfortably in it. Monongahela was homeward bound from South America waters after a peaceful cruise, when, one April night, awful screams brought everyone running to cabin number 2. Outside, on the floor, lay the assistant paymaster unconscious. They brought him round and asked what had caused his collapse. "A corpse in my berth," he managed to say. "One eye and a red beard. Horrible." He had wakened feeling strangely cold. In the bed with him seemed to be something chilly and wet. With indescribable horror, he had pulled the bedclothes aside and revealed the awful dead thing, seaweed entangled in its strangled beard. The ship's company crowded round and peered nervously into the cabin. The berth was empty, but the blankets were wet, and them a few trails of barnacle seaweed. One of the oddest things about such stories of sea apparitions is that it is always ordinary seamen or officers who come back, never the great naval commanders of the past. What has happened to the spirits of Nelson, Howe, Collingwood, Rodney, Benbow, and Blake? Nelson's shade, we are told, used to be seen walking briskly across the quadrangle of Somerset House to disappear into the Admiralty offices. Yet it is strange that they have never been seen transfigured aboard Britain's fighting ships at times of peril, urging the sailors on to victory and glory. Only one among them is reputed to return, Sir Francis Drake, perhaps because his body never came home, but lies slung atween the round shot on Nombre Dios Bay, the blue Caribbean rolling eternally about his bones. His ghost is not seen, but the legend goes that when England is in danger, his famous drum of state will sound in warning as he lay dying. He told those about him to bring it home to England and strike it when danger threatened. But it is said to have sounded sometimes of its own accord, summoning Drake to rise again and lead his Devon men against the Dons, or whoever the enemy happened to be at that time. The last occasion when it was heard, perhaps, beating in triumph, was at the surrender of the German High Seas Fleet at Scapa Flow on 21 June 1919. There are tales, too, of Drake's haunting a fortress-like house on Dartmoor and of the discovery under its lawn of skeleton of a gigantic man with an Elizabethan watch by its side. Perhaps these were the remains of one of Drake's daring crews who sailed aboard the Golden Hind. From the farthest shore of the seven seas to the galleon-haunted Goodwin Sands, phantom ships and their sailors float eternally, terrorizing or protecting the living. Are they really fog-wreathed shapes of illusion caused by changing light and poor visibility, or the result of over-generous grog rations, or simply what so many witnesses have believed them to be throughout the centuries? They came back. So this is a new chapter. They came back, and the next song is The Return of Admiral Tryon. It had been a glorious day, a midsummer's day, said some, which deserved to go down in history simply as that. For whether the pundits agreed on the 21st or 22nd of June as the astronomical middle of summer in England, it was palpably obvious that the real heat of summer invariably came after this oddly chosen date. But in 1893, the 22nd of June was a glorious sun-drenched scorcher. As many of Queen Victoria's subjects as had been able to get there had spent at least a part of that day paddling or even recklessly bathing along the circumference of Her Majesty's coastline. One refers, of course, to the United Kingdom as it is now styled. But the good Queen's empire spread across the world even as far down and under the globe as Australia and New Zealand, where today, incredibly, it was midwinter. Her Majesty, in 1893, had more coastline than she could add up. In London, where the only coastline belonged to the not too salubrious Thames, the day had been almost alarmingly hot, and when the early evening brought a pleasant breeze to lower the temperature, it lowered at the same time the very real anxiety of Lady Tryon. For scorching summer days are all very well at one's country seat, or even at the seaside, but to a London hostess giving a large and expensive ball indoors in the most exclusive and expensive part of the metropolis, they are a nightmare. In those well-starched, well-stayed days, many a guest would rue the fact that he or she had accepted weeks in advance an engagement which turned out to be formal, constricting, and hot. How much better to laze in one's own garden, eat a pleasant simple meal, wash down with a few glasses of a lightly chilled white wine, rather than get oneself up in this boiled shirt for those hideously uncomfortable stays. And dance. But to Lady Tryon, a Clementina, still beautiful after 34 years of marriage to her gallant handsome, and distinguished naval officer, the elements decided, in the nick of time, to be kind. Before the day was out, fate would have dealt her a crushing blow. But busy with preparation for the ball that evening at her Eaton Square home, she was of course unaware of this and delighted by the change in the weather. There was now a pleasant chill in the air, and her hundreds of candles vied for attention with an unclouded summer twilight on the other side of the windows. Many of these she had even felt obliged to get the servants to close. Have we perhaps suggested in an earlier paragraph that a hot and humid evening might have made some of Lady Tryon's guests rueful at having accepted her invitation? If so, then we hasten to correct the impression. She was one of the few exceptions for whom every single one would willingly have braved terrors far more alarming than dissolving stiff shirts or agonizing strays. For Lady Tryon's orchestra would be superb, her refreshments delectable. But had her ladyship provided only a lone fiddler and a few dozen bottles of stone ginger beer, this would not have deterred anyone. For to be invited to one of Lady Tryon's parties was to have arrived in the really important sense of the word. One was somebody. For this, Clementina deserved a good share of the credit. She was, as we have noted, still a beautiful woman, but, far more than that, she was intelligent, understanding, and witty. With the whole of London society to choose from, a society excitingly bolstered by visiting dignitaries from abroad, Clementina could ensure that her parties were a success. But her real sympathy, her understanding of lesser mortals, were such that no wallflower stayed glued to the wainscoting, no embarrassed young man remained blushing in his corner before the kindly Clementina swept into action. She had, they said, eyes in the back of her head. These took everything, and then her lightning hostess brain decided whether the pair should be united, joined to each other, or linked with other partners. Whichever decision she took, it rarely turned out badly, and it was common knowledge that more than one romance had flowered into marriage from a chance of meeting in Eaton Square. But Clementina would have been first to admit that much of her success stemmed from that of her extraordinary husband. Sir George Tryon was a truly remarkable man whose naval career to this moment spanned 45 years of embellished success. To mention his name in the Admiralty itself was to cause a hush to swell up and fill those high-ceilinged rooms, perhaps followed by the respectful query, "Wonder what the extraordinary fellow's up to now?" This very question, phrased perhaps more delicately, was asked by half the guests at Lady Tryon's party. Only a dolt would be unfamiliar with the fact that Tryon had been commanding the Mediterranean station for 4 years, since his elevation to Vice Admiral in 1889. But news in those days took long to travel, and Vice Admiral Sir George Tryon might be at one end of that inland sea or the other, and it would be weeks before anyone found out. He might even be ashore, perhaps in Naples, finishing another of his books on naval tactics. "Yes," said Lady Tryon, from the 20th time that night, "it is the most awful shame he can't be with us tonight. He'll be back soon, his tour of duty's almost up, but at the moment his work takes up all his time. Yes, he's still with Victoria, his flagship. He'll be very upset he missed you. I'll write him." Within an hour, there would be plenty of people, stunned people, to recall that phrase, "He'll be back soon." And there would be many others who would wonder why the woman who said those words should be the only person not to see him. But George Tryon is not going to make his appearance just yet, and as he is a very real historical figure whose exploits occupy many chapters of naval history, we can await his arrival by having a quick look at a brilliant, eccentric career. He was the third son of Thomas Tryon, a country squire who ran a large estate, Bulwick Park, in Northamptonshire. There were gossips, even then, who could always dig up something slightly discreditable about the famous, and these maintained about the family. Why, they were a lot o' immigrant Dutchmen come over here and made their pile, they did. Quite possibly this was true, but the immigrant Dutchmen were proud of having lived at Bulwick since early in the 17th century. They had been there at least when James I and James VI, an immigrant, if ever there was one, came to England. George Tryon was a clever child, and it seems likely that his decision to join the Royal Navy rather than do any of the 101 things open to a man of his standing and his gifts came a little later than it usually does. He left Eton halfway through his studies and became a Royal Navy cadet. As a result, he was not only older at 16 than the others, but also a lot bigger, standing over 6 feet in his naval socks. His first foreign posting was to that Mediterranean station, which half a century later would become his final tragic resting place. He traveled out as a seagoing midshipman and was then a little nonplussed by being landed as a soldier to fight in that gallant and desperately needed naval brigade in the Crimean War. Midshipman Tryon distinguished himself as a soldier, and his promotion to lieutenant was accordingly sooner than it might have been. He owed it, his admiral told him, to the conduct and character you have displayed. Not the sort of citation to set Fleet Street afire, but from a mid-19th century British admiral, this was praise indeed, and George Tryon's promotion continued ahead of his contemporaries, and always for some very good reason. It was in 1867, when he had reached the rank of captain, that he took leave in Norway. Not for George Tryon, the waters, placid or shallow, or both, of a British river, he would fish dangerously on a Norwegian fjord, and incongruously, he was recalled from mid-fjord, in effect, to rush back to England and take charge of naval preparations for the Abyssinian War. He took this, like everything else, in his long stride, and although Britain's Abyssinian War may have entered world history as a great campaign, no one could fault his naval handling. This involved not only the delivery of all British troops against some opposition, but their continued supply. George Tryon's powers of improvisation were taxed to the utmost. The Abyssinian War was only an episode. Already, Tryon was working hard on 2 apparently unrelated aspects of seamanship. One of these, and far the more important, was naval intelligence, the ascertaining of what one's enemy plans to do and what he has to do with it. Naval intelligence can accurately be called the brainchild of George Tryon, R.N., and it was during a brief spell ashore child of George Tryon, so it was a brief spell of shore duty with the Admiralty that Tryon actually started the Department of Naval Intelligence. His other naval interest seems odd indeed to us today. Almost a circus trick. We must remember that this was long before the day of wireless telegraphy and secret ciphers. In the 19th century, if you wanted your fleet to perform a maneuver in action, you ran up flags, and you knew that the enemy could read them just as well as your own captains. So Tryon tried naval maneuvering without signals. His contemporaries were loud in their contempt. It was a circus trick, highly dangerous, suicidal, and more in the same vein. Nowadays, with radar, ciphered, WT, scrambled, RT, and ATSI conferences on closed-circuit television, it may seem strange that a fleet could only take action on the basis of a few brightly colored bits of cloth hoisted up by the appropriately named flagship. But it is even stranger that a fleet could be made to perform the most intricate maneuvers simply by the sudden movement of a flagless flagship. George Tryon gets away with this damn silly nonsense, doesn't get cashiered, as he damned well ought to be, simply because the damn fellow's so far away. So said a contemporary, and there was an element of truth in his remark. Tryon was now a vice-admiral, knighted in Her Majesty's Jubilee honours and commanding the Australia station. But at the time of our party, 22 June 1893, Sir George Tryon was back in the Mediterranean where his career had begun. And although there were people who continued to object to the naval maneuvering without signals, he still from time to time tried out, and those who assured all who would listen that Tryon would try it on just once too often and send the entire British fleet to the bottom. It is sadly ironic that what now took place had no connection with the flagless madness, which had earned him both fame and notoriety. Back to Eaton Square, the party soon filled with happy, confident guests. The string orchestra was playing in those pre-ragtime days, soothing yet rhythmic music, and a few couples had taken the floor. Others were busying themselves with the champagne, the astonishing variety of hot and cold foods, all of which was being dispensed in the next room. Some of the guests had been invited for the first time to this social mecca, and their delight at the honor was impossible to conceal. Others had been to Eaton Square before Lady Tryon's Eaton Square, that is, and were confident that they had scaled the social ladder to its topmost rung. These two were happy. By 11, the ballroom was crammed to overflowing with handsome men and women and others who made up with distinction of their manner and their attire for the shortcomings of nature. It had become almost uncomfortably warm, what with the exertion and the refreshment, and when the sweating orchestra played a final bar and put down their instruments for a short interval, most guests were relieved. Here was a chance, without feigning gout or the vapours, to cut back on the violent exercise and go back for another glass or two of bubbly. No one ever knew how the big door at the east end of the ballroom opened. It had been closed all evening on purpose for to spoil the look of the room when open. Perhaps at 11:25 a servant's or presumptuous guest had swung the vast thing back on its hinges and let in the cool air. Discussing this for months later, and still in hushed whispers, the guests seemed to remember that there had been no one near the inside of the door, no one in the ballroom in a position to open it, and no servant would admit to opening it from the outside. Vice Admiral Sir George Tryon, KCB, commanding the Mediterranean station, had simply opened it himself. The music had halted, the center of the floor was empty, but there were about 50 people, including her ladyship, standing around the edges of the room, talking. Lady Tryon had her back to the door and was talking to a voluble little man who had been invited for the first time with his overdressed, overweight little wife, and was determined to make an impression. Some of the other guests had made no effort to conceal their contempt for the couple, and for this reason alone the wise and kindly Lady Tryon was listening to the man with every show of interest. She noticed suddenly that her conversant's eyes were on stalks. he had stopped his flood of banality in mid-sentence. Lady Tryon noticed, too, that every other soul in the room had stopped talking. It was uncanny, as if every single person at her party had been struck dumb. She turned round, took in that east door of the ballroom was unexpectedly open, and felt a drop from it on her flushed cheeks. But what struck her most was the look of shocked surprise on the faces of each and every one of her guests. She watched them as their heads swiveled very slowly from east to west, on from left to right as she faced those on the far side of the empty ballroom. And what was most startling in Lady Tryon's view was the variety of expressions displayed. For while everyone present seemed to evince surprise, there were superimposed on this basic human expression tiny variations as in music. For some of her guests seemed surprised and delighted, others seemed surprised and uncomprehending. Many of her own sex seemed surprised and about to faint. One man, with an especially annoying surprised look on his face, brought on doubtless by an excess of the Bollinger, lurched forward and struck out an arm as if he were shaking hands with someone who exists only in the fuddled recesses of his own imagination. Lady Tryon made a mental note that although she would invite the humble Cartwrights again, Lord North would not be on her list for some time. The eyes, the faces, continued their swiveling. To the hostess, it was baffling, upsetting. The floor was absolutely empty, and yet here were her guests, mouths open, gawping at it. Whatever it was, they were imagining whatever ghost, and her ladyship had no time for ghosts, had swept through her ballroom. It seemed to make its exit through the open western door. She watched in wonder and some discomfiture as her guest stood looking inexplicably at the open, empty west door of the ballroom. The string orchestra, glasses in hand, were in position. "Gentlemen," she said, and her voice had a strange, faraway sound to it. "Gentlemen, play us something gay." The orchestra, as if this was the one thing they too most wanted from life, put down their glasses and broke into a lively air. Under its influence, people began to move again. A servant closed the east door. Two couples, ashen of complexion despite the perspiration pouring down their faces, got bravely up to dance. Months later, Sir Jasper Hode was to explain what had happened, and his account, verified by every other guest present in the ballroom at 11:25 that evening, will go down in history. I had to summon up a bit of courage to ask Clementina if she'd seen what I'd seen, but I did, and she let me have it. "I don't know what you saw, Jasper. I only had the sensation of watching as all my guests ridiculously moved heads like mechanical toys from one side to the other. I saw nothing else, not a thing." Yet it seems that they imagined that they were seeing something. "But Clementina," I said to her, "it was George." That's what I said to her, and she said, "Don't be ridiculous, Jasper. George is at the far end of the Mediterranean. If he'd got back on some sudden leave, well then obviously I'd have seen him too." "Clementina, my dear, I only hope and pray that this means nothing sad and supernatural. I assure you that every man and woman in that ballroom saw your husband walk in the east door and out the west. He turned and smiled at everyone, including you, my dear, but he didn't stop, and when he got to the west door, well, he just vanished." There were at least 50 people to back up Sir Jasper's story, and the only person in the room who had not seen the ghost, for surely that was what it was Lady Tryon herself. Few ghost stories, tales of the supernatural, lend themselves to the exact chronology, but the visit of Admiral Tryon to his wife's ball does just this. He had died tragically as the first of his wife's guests was entering the Eaton Square house on the evening of 22 June 1893, and that each and every one of his wife's guests had seen him stride through the room. What had happened? After all, the Mediterranean station was a fairly peaceful one in June 1893. How had its admiral died? Through a tragic error in signaling. No, it was not a maneuver without signals, very much the reverse. Tryan's fleet had moved that day to the coast of Syria, and off that coast, as his command approached in two columns, 1,200 yards apart, Tryon and his flagship Victoria gave the clear, well-understood flag signal, invert course in succession. For some presumably quite orthodox reason, Tryon wanted his fleet the other way about before it dropped anchor for the night. But, incredibly, he had not made allowance for the fact that his Victoria and his second-in-command's Caper Down were very large ships, too big and unwieldy to turn inwards in reverse direction, like marching soldiers, and miss each other in 1,200 yards. Horrified, the crews of every other ship watched, praying that Tryon was planning a wide unorthodox sweep which would take him and his column outside Camperdown and hers. Camperdown would thus remain on his port beam and not change, as the maneuver usually implied, to being on his starboard and a great deal closer. But no. Admiral Tryon's last words have been recorded as, "It is entirely my fault." At that moment, his Victoria had her starboard side cut open by the sharp steel bow of the Camperdown. Within seconds, Victoria's bow had dipped below the sea, her stern had cocked up, she capsized, sinking straight to the bottom. Admiral Tryon was never seen again, except once in Eaton Square that evening. So on that note, boys and girls, it is break time. Alright, so we have Miss McKaylin Hay with W No, Pins and Needles, and Mirror, and Miss McKaylin Hay is from Ontario, Canada. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this musical break.
Your troubled heart bleeds like a river. It's rushing towards fields painted greener. It doesn't see the demons behind Better the devil, you know. 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 Talking on pins and needles, every word through a microscope. You keep stomping down on the ground while I've been stuck on this tightrope. I just wanna say what I wanna say without your sentence. I'm not willing to do the time when I'm innocent, and I'm innocent. Talking on pins and needles. Talking on pins and needles. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. Walked on my share of thin ice with your blowtorch at my feet. You won't ever see me beg, so take this tongue off your leash. I'm gonna say what I wanna say, don't need permission. Interpret it how you want, it's my decision. Talking on pins and needles. Talking on pins and needles. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. Dancing on shattered glass, kicking the pieces all around. My safety has been broken, this is now a hunting ground. Talking on pins and needles. Talking on pins and needles. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm done, and I'm done, and I'm done, done, done. I'm gonna hang it up, hang it up, hang it up. And I'm left upon my chest, I'll attest. I don't really wanna forget to forget you taught me how to turn a blind eye. I showed you how to keep your shoulder cold. No one walked away without a scar, scar, scar. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror. You taught me how to turn a blind eye. I showed you how to keep a shoulder cold. No one walked away without a scar, scar, scar. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror. I've been digging through the pieces. Your heart is out of reach, but objects may seem nearer through this rippled mirror.
Welcome back, and thank you so much for joining us tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. Let's see, I switched over the microphone to the... hold on one second. So it was on the Yeti, and now I have it on the 920, but I didn't change it over here on the Spreaker Studio. There it is. Can you still hear me? Yes. Alright. So, hopefully this is clearer and we're not continuing to break up. So this next story is called The Figure on the White Road. The funeral procession made its way slowly down the winding roads shadowed by the hills. The burial was over. Everyone was very tired. They were on their way home again. During the journey, they had watched the sunset, and now in the valleys it was already dark as night. At last they left the hills behind them and came out on the white limestone highway where an illusion of daylight returned as the white road reflected the light of the night. It was then that two men in the leading car saw a figure coming down the slope towards them. "Who's that wandering about at this hour?" asked one. "God knows," said the other. "So shall we in a minute. He's coming straight towards us." The figure drew closer. First, they identified the clothes, the black frock coat, which had been a familiar sight in the parish for many years. And then the face. A face they knew well, yet horribly changed. The familiar turned unfamiliar. The nightmare came true. "It's himself!" gasped one of the men. "Lord have mercy on us! It's himself!" And who was himself? The stranger who was yet no stranger, and who now terrified the mourners. So Jim says it's a lot better, still a bit, but not as bad. That is so odd. Oh, so frustrating. His name was Bernard McSweeney, and he belonged to a farming family which had lived for generations in this country of northwestern Ireland. He had been born in the 1870s, and at first he was worked on the land and lived with his mother in a little whitewashed farmhouse. He was thoughtful, dreamy, always a little strange. His mother loved and admired him, but felt she never really knew him. When he told her that his humdrum life was not enough, that he wished to train as a priest in the Roman Catholic Church, she was proud of him, revered him for his decision. She talked about him to the neighbors. "My boy in the church, he's so good, so clever. He's a wonderful son, a priest." To her, it was better for a man to be a priest than anything else in the world. Time passed, he did well, and at last was appointed priest in charge of the hill parish not far from the farmhouse of his birth. In his work, Father McSweeney proved efficient and conscientious. He carried out parish business without sparing himself. He kept his record straight. He gave excellent sermons, although sometimes they were rather above his parishioners' heads. He studied alone at night, and the light would shine out from his little house long after everyone else was in bed. Strangers visited him, casual travelers and tramps. He would put up temporary beds for them in his own rooms. He never turned anyone away, however unpleasant they might seem to be more respectable people round about. Apparently, he did nothing wrong at all, and no one could pin down exactly what was wrong. Yet he wasn't liked. His parishioners never quite regarded him as a friend. They didn't come to him with their own personal troubles. They were ill at ease with him. Some of them were even afraid of him without knowing why. Members of his own family, which there were many in the area, felt separate from him. They put it down to the fact that he was the priest and they were ordinary farming folk. Yet somehow there had always been this chilling barrier between him and ordinary people. When Father McSweeney was just over 50, he became ill mysteriously. Within a few months, he wasted away and died. People were shaken by the sudden death, but not particularly sorrowful. They hoped that someone less meticulous and more warm-hearted would take his place. However, with family loyalty and surviving relatives planned to give him a grand funeral. The body was taken to his mother's house. She was old now, frail and distraught with sorrow. Her boy in the church was gone forever. She wasn't well enough to go with the funeral procession herself, but it would start out from her house and the mourners would all return to her afterwards. So on the funeral day, she stood alone at her door and watched the procession of tramps, carts, and cars. The year was 1925. Start on its journey to the hills. Among those mountains was the Rocky graveyard where members of the family had been buried for centuries. Before the day ended, she was to receive the strangest visit of her life. But of course, she had no notion of that at the time. The long, sad procession reached the graveyard. Other parishioners and priests were there aside from the relatives. The burial ceremony was quiet and formal, and when it was over, they all felt that sense of relief which follows a funeral. The dead man was under the ground. Life goes on for the living, so they were in the weary but placid state on the way back. Many of the women were asleep or half asleep in the vehicles. All they wanted now was to reach the cozy farmhouse where the priest's mother waited with warm fire and hot drinks for them all. But before they reached the bright fireside, they were to meet himself on the white limestone road. For the figure which steadily approached the leading car was the priest whom they had just buried. The priest, not in grave clothes, but in the frock coat in which they'd last seen him alive. After the first gasp of horrified astonishment, those who saw him were too petrified to speak. They could only stare. The priest turned his head away slightly as he passed the leading car and walked the full length of the following vehicles, but they noticed how horrible he looked. His skin seemed vividly white, far whiter than living paler. His eyes were wide open and stared without blinking. They glittered diamond bright. His teeth, strong and white, seemed to be thrust forward, the lips drawn back and the gums exposed. When he had passed the last car, he disappeared round the bend of the road as if he had never been. A wave of terror passed through the whole procession. Some of the women wept with fear. There were whispered exclamations and questions. "Did you see him?" "Yes, but I couldn't believe my eyes. Did you?" "I saw him. I thought it must be dreaming." "You weren't dreaming. I saw him too." "So did I." "And I. He looked like some devil or a wolf. It couldn't have been him." "But it was him. I always knew there was something terrible about him. This is why we never liked him." "Shh! Don't speak ill of the dead. The dead should stay buried." Panic, passion, anguish, terror. They had seen dead men walking and were frightened out of their wits. "Shall some of us go after him?" No, let's go home." No one was placid or sleepy now. The cars and traps and carts were full of people who had never felt more awake in their lives. They put on speed. They wanted to get away from the white limestone highway. They wanted the security of walls about them, a fire to warm them, and curtains to shut out the dark and whatever creatures might be wandering there. But as they drew nearer to the farmhouse where Mrs. McSweeney waited, they stopped and held a conference. What should they tell her? Anything or nothing? "Nothing," said the mourners. "Not a word of this, his mother. We must all swear, keep our mouths shut. The poor woman's grief-stricken enough without hearing a story like that about his son." "Are you sure it was him?" asked a woman who had been asleep through it all. Those who had seen him were sure, and they were numerous. This was no case of one man's flight of fancy or one woman's succumbing to hysteria. Now they gathered in the porch outside the mother's house. They were still whispering together, whispering voices among the whispering trees. But on one thing they said, and they all agreed. Mrs. McSweeney was to be told nothing of the vision they had seen. Calming themselves, exercising all their self-control, they knocked on her door, ready to smile and greet her comfortably when she opened it. But she didn't come. The house was silent. Surely she should have been waiting eagerly for their return, listening for their knock. "Hello, we're back. Open up, darling, we're here." They knocked again and again. Nothing. On either side of the porch were two small windows through which one could see into the hall. They had hesitated to peer inside, like people looking through keyholes, but now one of them did. "Well, can you say anything?" he asked. "Yes, she's there. She's lying face down on the floor. We'll have to break in." They broke open the door and gathered round the prostrate figure of the old woman. "Is she dead?" "I don't know. She's as cold as ice." "No, she's not dead. She's breathing. Oh, thank God." They called to her and chafed her hands. They lifted her on to her bed. At last she opened her eyes. They gave her something to drink. "Drink this, darling. You're all right now. You fainted, that's all, and no wonder, after what you've been through." All around her they hovered, trying to give her solace, but all she could do was stare ahead of her in horror. "What happened?" they asked her. "Did something happen to frighten you?" "Yes, I had a visitor." "A visitor? What sort of visitor?" "Where is he?" she said. "There's no one here but yourself and us." "You're quite safe. Who was the visitor?" "I must have fainted from the shock of seeing him. You won't believe me. I don't know how to tell you." They exchanged glances, half knowing what was coming. "Tell us what happened," they said. "What time is it?" she asked. They told her the time. "Then it happened about half an hour ago. I heard footsteps outside. Then I knocked on the door. At first I thought it might be you, back earlier than I expected. Then I realized it couldn't be all of you, or I'd have heard the carts and cars. Those newfangled cars make quite a noise, don't they?" "Yes, go on. You heard a knock on the door." "I couldn't think who it could be. Everyone was at the funeral. Who would be calling on me? So I looked out through the side window to see who was there." She began to gasp and wail. "It was him. It was Bernard. He was standing there by the edge, just as if he were still alive. Yet I saw his dead body in the house only this morning, so I knew it couldn't be him, but it was." "You saw his face?" they asked. "His face, his poor face. Such a terrible expression. The light shone directly on him. He was turned away from me a little bit. I saw his features twisted, his teeth jutting out, his lips pulled back, his eyes glaring as if he was staring at horrors, and his skin was as white as—" "A ghost," someone murmured. "Yes, I believe I saw the ghost of my son," she said. "What did you do? Did you let him in?" And they looked round warily, half expecting the dead priest to walk into the room, baring his teeth at them and fixing them with that inhumane glare. "Of course I was going to let him in, ghost or no ghost," said the mother proudly. "He was still my boy. Whatever terrible thing had happened to him, I moved to open the door, but then I was so terrified that my legs went weak under me and everything went black. I don't know what happened after that until you came. Please believe me. I really did see him." Her relatives exchanged glances and nods. They changed their decision to say nothing. "We believe you," said one of them. "We saw him too." And they told her of the figure on the white road. None of the members of that family, especially the mother, ever forgot that day of the funeral. And the man who had just been buried appeared to them afterwards with an aspect of fleshly life, and a look of cruelty which they had often sensed beneath the surface of his quiet manners, and which had made them withdraw from him and fear him. He had always been a secret man, and he left this fearful mystery behind him. He was not seen again. The Lovers of Porthwara. Down in the southwest England, they will still, almost eagerly, tell you the story of the lovers of Porthwara. And if you ask them at that little fishing village, they will even show you Sweetheart's Cove. The story has been current so long, its details virtually unchanged, that it would be a brave man who questions its veracity. The actual sweetheart is still there to be seen, washed smooth by the surging tides of that southwestern coast, and no doubt it is even smoother now than when Nancy and her William sat there 150 years ago. But to start at the beginning, Nancy Hawkingley, the strikingly beautiful black-haired girl, with the hair and features that belonged to that ancient corner of Britain. She was a small-boned, delicate-looking creature whose long tresses were strikingly set off by a pair of wide-open, light blue eyes. By the age of 19, she had had many suitors and rejected them all. And then, to the great distress of her parents, she fell hopelessly in love with a stranger, a sailor, William Pullen. There was nothing wrong with William. He was a fine-looking man excelling at games and much admired by young boys of the area. Nor did he lack for adoring females who wished to make him their own forever. But to Nancy's parents, no husband could be less suitable. Sailors, in their estimation, were rough, drunken creatures, and although this was the most arrant nonsense in William's case, as it is in the case of most sailors, there was no denying their second objection. Sailors went away for long, long periods. The very fact that William was the reverse of a rough, drunken creature provided an adequate reason for his own mother to raise objection to the union. He was a wonderful son who supported her in her widowhood from his earnings at sea, and he was greatly admired and respected by all from old Mother Tringleton of Porthwara, whom in his warm-hearted way he often helped behind the counter of her general shop, to the children whose toys he repaired when they broke. William's mother was none too keen to be exchanged, as she saw it, for another, much younger woman. But when at last she met Nancy, for the Pullens' mother and son lived in the neighboring village of Porthcurno, she fell almost as much under the girl's spell as her son. She took to Nancy immediately. But unremitting opposition continued from Nancy's parents. If William got himself a job on dry land, after all, he did seem to be good at everything he put his hand to. They might change their minds. As a sailor, they would ever remain bitterly opposed to such a union. The young couple gave this a lot of thought. But seafaring was so obviously in William's blood that Nancy knew a marriage on her parents' terms would make him unhappy. William hopefully pointed out that he would soon have command of his own small vessel, and as captain he could and would take his wife wheresoever he went. Soon? Well, that did depend on a number of factors, but there was no reason to believe that within 5 years, with the money he was saving and the blessing of the line which employed him, he could not be his own skipper. And then Nancy, who would see sights of which she had never dreamed, places where beautifully colored birds sang and fluttered among tropical trees, and where strange and exciting wild animals roamed. And she could bring back rare and precious presents for her mother and father. Still, this wasn't good enough for that stubborn pair. 5 years was a long time, and in any case, they didn't want their daughter gallivanting at great risk over the 7 seas. They wanted her in Porthwara, married to a man who worked in a shop or at a steady trade, or even to a farmer. Young women heeded their elders much more than they do now, and so when the time came for William's ship to sail, taking him away for 3 months, there was no question of their getting married first, as they both so dearly wanted. But on the night before William sailed for the Spice Islands, they arranged to meet in a little cove beyond the village. There they could sit, as they had in the past, with their arms about each other. They could say again, to the murmuring of the sea, the thing lovers say, and next time for sure, if William were not yet in a position to take Nancy with him, they would get married nonetheless, and the devil take all their parents. He would set up in a little cottage he had already found many miles from Porthgwara. He might even get a longshore leave. These things could be arranged so that he could get a shore job for a few months, and then they could live happily together as man and wife. So, on this March night, at different moments and from different directions, there might be no gossip. They arrived at their cove. The milky whiteness of a full moon was streaming down, not an entirely unmixed blessing, as it meant they could be seen by some chance passer-by. Soon they were sitting arm in arm, with their bare feet on chilly sand. "I love you, William," she said. "You'll never forget that, will you?" "How could I, darling? And I love you too. I'm keeping myself for you. Nancy, you must believe that." "And I'll be faithful if I have to wait forever." "You won't have to wait long, I promise." And so they sat, till the tide turned and the water started to rush in again. At Porthgwara, the tide was rapid, channeled in the throat of the bay, and once it starts to come in, it is a foolish man indeed who stays there admiring it. Within a few minutes, he can be surrounded by seething water and will need to be a strong swimmer to regain the shore. They left their rock with the water beginning to lap between their ankles. A few yards, walked together, arm in arm, a brief embrace, and they parted to go their separate ways. William's ship sailed with the next day's ebb tide for the Spice Islands. They had said their farewells, and Nancy watched from a distance as the three-masted vessel made its way out to the open sea. It happened down the bay, its square-rigged sails filled with the easterly wind, and in a few minutes it had shrunk to a tiny speck. A moment later, it slithered gently over the horizon. Later that day, Nancy went to the village shop, old Mother Treglone's General Emporium. Mother Treglone was a kindly soul, and had good reason to feel affection for the sailor who so often lent a hand when her rheumatism made shopkeeper's job almost impossibly painful. She knew all about William's love for Nancy, and approved. When Nancy came in, the old lady served her, and then, as the shop was otherwise empty, asked her back to the little storeroom and gave her a glass of mead. She took one herself, and they clinked them together. "To William's speedy return," she said, "and then your marriage and a long, happy life together." "Thank you," said Nancy. A tear trickled down her cheek. "But you know, Miss Treglone, I sometimes think I can never happen. My parents, it doesn't seem as if they'll ever change, not for years." "Nonsense, my child," said Mother Treglone. "It will happen, and soon, and you will be happy forever." Forever? Nancy took that word and cherished it. But the months went by, and never a word came from William, nor news of his ship. At first, this was not too alarming, as ships were often diverted at various ports of call, and sent on different, often very long detours. The communication with home was difficult at times, for these were days before wireless telegraph. But after 5 months without a word, Nancy was not only upset, she was terrified. Surely, even if the ship were being redirected right round the globe, it must pass other vessels and be able to send messages via them. Nancy's heartless parents were openly pleased. They began to extol the virtues of other young men in and around Porthgwara. Then Nancy vanished. Her parents now became filled with remorse. Obviously, The girl, goaded to breaking point and tense with strain, had left them to go to London. There was a coach once a week, and her disappearance was noticed a few hours after it had left. But even now, her parents' feelings were more of shame than of compassion. If marriage to a sailor were bad, the prospects for a young, attractive, penniless girl in the sinful capital were appalling. They suddenly took to attending both matins and evensong each Sunday, and whatever other service might be conducted by the rector during the week. But not a word from Nancy, nor, and the months continued to go by, from William or his ship. Spring had ripened into summer, autumn was slipping towards winter, and then, to the whole village's delight, a letter for Nancy in William's hand from New Zealand, and in the same post-coach delivery, one from William for his mother. At last, everyone would know the news. Nancy's parents controlled their eagerness to rip her letter open and see what had caused the long delay which had indirectly made her daughter leave them. The information was supplied by William's mother, who came in from Porthcurno to show her letter to Mother Treglown. William explained that in his much-altered trip he had written at least weekly and posted a large batch of letters in South Africa. 5 months later, when he himself was worried that he had got no reply to the Australian address he had given, he learnt that the vessel carrying all his letters had sunk off Lagos. It was exactly a week after his letter had been read, and the one for Nancy placed carefully, unopened, on the mantelpiece, that the girl appeared again in Porthquara. It was old Mother Treglown, hobbling up the high street, who saw her. At first she couldn't believe her eyes. The girl was changed in some odd, indefinable way. "Nancy, oh Nancy!" she croaked, and the girl turned round. She didn't smile, though. "It is you, Nancy." "Yes, Miss Treglown, it is." "Ain't you been away?" "Yes, that's right, I've been away." "You've been sadly missed, Nancy." The girl said nothing. "And would it be prying if I asked you where you'd been? You don't have to tell me, you know." Miss Treglown, old Mother Treglown, with a middle-aged daughter in Bristol, knew about these things. There were some with long memories and unkind tongues who called her Miss Treglown. Whatever her title, the old lady knew all about the girls who left the village, went somewhere distant, the story of widowhood or separation, and there gave birth to a child. Sometimes it was fostered out. Sometimes it was properly adopted into some kind family. "You wouldn't be prying, Miss Treglown, but, oh, I've been a long, long way." And that seemed to be the end of it. "You seen your parents yet? You know, there's a great thick letter on their mantel-shelf for you from William, but you haven't been home." "I haven't been home." "Oh, I see." Miss Treglown felt she ought to leave well alone, but she couldn't help wrangling on. "You see, Nancy, darling, he wrote to his old mother, too, and he told her he'd been writing ever so often. So he'd have been writing ever so often, even much more often to you. And of course the ship was ordered all over the place, but managed to post the letter somewhere. Can't remember where he wrote it was, but the awful thing, Nancy, that the ship bringing all those letters home is sank somewhere. Now I think you ought to go home, even if you don't want to see your old folks. I know they weren't very kind, but they didn't understand. You see, and just open that letter." Now, while this conversation, or perhaps monologue, was going on, one of Porthquara's fishermen, Gerald Matthews, walked by with his wife, Lily. They gave a start of recognition, and Lily, who loved to be the the purveyor of news, dragged her husband quickly away. This was a tasty tidbit of a happening, and she must away and tell Rosie Tregunno. "Thank you, Miss Tregunno," and the girl walked away very slowly, without any sign of haste or enthusiasm, almost as if she had no idea of where she wanted to go, almost as if she were a stranger in her own village. The old lady took her head in dismay and wonder and limped back towards her shop. Later that afternoon, Nancy's mother was in the shop, looking pale and drawn. "Something very strange has happened," she said. "Oh?" "Yes, it's very worrying, uncanny. Someone's come and taken that letter for Nancy, and you know, the worst thing of all, we were out and the door was locked, and still somebody managed to get in and steal that letter." The woman bit her lip as the tears started to her eyes. "But you didn't see Nancy?" asked Mother Tregunno. "No, and that's another strange thing, for it's all round the village that she's been seen talking to you, but there's no sign of her anywhere." Old Mother Tregunno was strangely disturbed. She began to busy herself among the big, dusty jars of sweets. She filled up a large paper bag of the bull's-eyes she knew Nancy was always fond of, and which she would give the girl when she came in, as assuredly she would. Weird. So they're saying it's getting bad again. I don't understand it. It's gotta. I'm hoping it's just Spreaker and where it records everywhere else will be okay, but I'm not sure, Sandra and Mr. Morse, what is going on with the sound. Alright, let's see, where were we? So, she knew Nancy was always fond of these syrup candies, and when she came home, she would have a treat for her. But would she come home? Mother Tregunno found herself trembling. She recalled now that the strange, almost otherworldly look about the girl, the hopelessness of manner, the unfocused eyes, the sense of utter forlornness she had conveyed now struck a chill into the old woman. It was almost as if, oh my God, no, but yes, it was almost as if she were already dead. She shuddered then with a quick shake of the head, but she put such thoughts behind her. She looked at the tense, tear-stained face of Mrs. Hawking, and although she had never liked the woman, her kind old heart melted. "She'll be back directly," she said comfortingly. "You'll see." But Nancy did not come back. There was no doubt that she had vanished again as suddenly as she had reappeared, and the whole village was in an uproar of speculation about it. About a week after her strange meeting with Nancy, as November was moving into a surprisingly warm first week of December, and on a Sunday when her shop of course was closed, old Mother Tregunno took a constitutional during the afternoon. She often went great distances for one so lame, and today she planned to hobble with her stick perhaps a mile along the seafront before it grew dark. To her delight, she saw Nancy walking ahead of her. Her unexpressed doubts were suddenly relieved. Nancy was here after all. She didn't call out, just went steadily along, leaning on her stick, and watched the pretty young girl go down onto the moist sand and walk out seawards for a few yards. Placidly, she sat on a large smooth rock, hands on her lap, decided it was none of her business and went on the little bit extra she'd planned. She was delighted, though, that the mystery of Nancy had been solved. For reasons best known to herself, and not unconnected perhaps with her parents' previous hostility, she must have been living somewhere close by for these last few days. Miss Treglone didn't go much farther, for a wintry wind got up very suddenly and dark clouds filled the sky. She turned back and was soon at the cove. Nancy was still there, but now, incredibly, seated beside her on that smooth rock was William Pullen. There was no possible doubt about it. Their arms were about each other, their heads were close together. Anyone could see they were very much in love. But had they seen how fast the tide was coming in? With its sudden icy wind, it was fairly racing up the cove, and already it was on three sides of the rock they were sharing. The old lady could see the danger in a situation of which the lovers, totally wrapped in each other, seemed quite unaware. "Nancy, William!" she croaked at the top of her lungs. "Come back! Come back!" Raymond. The broad categories of human personality, known as the extrovert and the introvert, have always existed and been expressed through the ages in the artist, the contemplative, and the mystic on the one hand, and the man of action on the other. But if ever there was an extroverted age, it occurred in 19th century Britain, when the rapid development of industrial technology combined with scientific outlook of unqualified materialism to give man the feeling that he himself was a finished product, a triumph of nature requiring no further improvement, and progress in the future would depend on the exploitation and manipulation of the outside world. Though not exactly sight, utopia was felt to be just around the corner. This blind, astonishing optimism, a bubble of romantic fantasy, should long since have collapsed in the debris of 2 world wars and their aftermath. Yet peoples and governments are so reluctant to abandon the dream that man is no more than the active factor in an economic, financial, and industrial equation, and once that has been solved, he will be free. Though we all know that this is not true, we cling to the belief because reality is more complicated, offering no utopias, and is therefore unpalatable. Fortunately, in this situation, nature herself supplies a corrective by making us uneasy, even neurotic, so forcing us to ask spiritual questions too long neglected. Who are we? Why are we here? That's funny. I think my elbow hit the mouse. Maybe it's just my internet, Jim. I don't know what the crack is going on. This is ridiculous. And it makes me wonder, like, how often do these issues happen? Like, does it happen every show, or is there a recent thing that's happening? Perhaps the box that I'm in renting or leasing is going bad, like, I don't know. It's hard to say. All right, so let's see, where are we? Fortunately, in this situation, nature herself supplies a corrective by making us uneasy, even neurotic, so forcing us to ask spiritual questions too long neglected. Who are we? Why are we here? What must we do? What is the path of evolution for the human race, and how can we follow it instead of taking some side turning? To answer these questions, particularly the last one, we require not only intuition, which does not work reliably for everyone, but a much firmer basis than we yet possess of incontrovertible knowledge about life, the universe, and human nature. And in this search, all lines of inquiry must be pursued, including that of parapsychology or psychical research. The Society of Psychical Research was founded by the group of Cambridge scholars in 1882, in the same decade as Freud began his study of psychology, not, as is often thought, with the prime object of exploring the question of survival after death, but to observe and study with the most rigorous objectivity all phenomena called paranormal, for instance, telepathy, clairvoyance, telekinesis, movements of objects at a distance, poltergeists, apparitions, hauntings, and mediumistic powers, though the interesting fact is that, without anyone's violation or volition, the survival question was forced on its attention at a comparatively early stage. In this development, a leading part was to be played by Sir Oliver Lodge. Oliver Lodge, 1851 through 1940, he was knighted for his service to psychics and physics in 1902, was descended from solid middle-class clergymen and school teachers on both sides of the family. As a young man, he had interested himself in physics and mechanics, obtaining his doctorate at University College London, and in due course became a pioneer in research into electricity. The phenomenon of electrolysis, electromagnetic waves, and wireless telegraphy. In 1879, he was appointed Professor of Physics at Liverpool University, became a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1887, and from 1900 to 1919 served as first principal of the new Birmingham University. In his objective desire to add to human knowledge and his rigorous scientific approach, he was typical of the scrupulous and serious-minded intellectuals who became associated with the society and its endeavors, but it was only slowly that he became directly involved. As a young man in the 1870s, Lodge had met a student named Edward Gurney, who was collecting data on hauntings and apparitions, and somewhat despite himself had been impressed by Gurney's seriousness and his hypothesis that such phenomena might be due to some unexplored extrasensory faculty operating between agent and participant. So on that note, you guys, oh my gosh, we're going to go to a music break. On this break, we have Miss Macalyn Hay from Ontario, Canada with Mirror, and then we have Miss Tracy Cruz she's from California, let's see, where she's from, right, Macalyn Hay from Ontario, and Tracy Cruz from Oakland, California. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this musical break.
I dove right in. wash away all the pain.
You wash every part.
Your love lives higher than all of the stars in the sky.
So high.
I may not wish on you to be by my side. You loving me, I feel like flying. You loving me, I feel like crying. Tears of joy fall from the sky to make us smile. Your love outshines all the rays of the morning light.
It's so bright.
I'm so blinded by your love that glows inside.
You always shine.
Your love is deeper than all of the roots of the trees.
It's so deep.
Thank you for planting your heart right next to me. You loving me, I feel like flying. You loving me, I feel like crying. Tears of joy fall from the sky. Tears of joy can make us smile, can make us smile. I feel like flying. You loving me, like flying, like crying. Tears of joy fall from the sky. Let your love rain down on me. We will grow so tall and free. I will shade all the pain that life will bring. Our love can weather anything. You loving me, I feel like flying. You loving me,
I feel like crying.
tears of joy fall from the sky to make us smile. You loving me, I feel like flying. You loving me, I feel like crying. Tears of joy fall from the sky to make us smile, to make us smile, to make us smile. I feel like crying. You loving me, I feel like crying. Tears of joy, smile to make me smile a million times. You loving me, I can't describe your love. I can't describe your love. It makes me smile. You make love worthwhile.
Now I can see how much your love has affected me. Everything you do makes me smile.
Boy, I don't know what to do. My heart is so confused. In the past, it's been put down, it's been shattered, and then I'm left without any clue to know the real truth about what I found. But with you, I found my common ground. Your love makes me emotional, 'cause you're the one that makes me feel emotional. You make me feel that love is real. 'Cause you're the one that makes me feel emotional. Ever since I was young,
When I met you, my life changed. Your love rained all over me. It was blissful, so special, essential. Life poetry, true beauty. We created, we made it. Reality, pure affection with expression. A connection was meant to be. You make me feel so good inside, like therapy for my mind. You make me feel so good inside. It was like flowers and candy, understanding how you're standing really must be love. I'm talking true, I'm talking real, and I felt it in my heart. It was like flowers and candy, understanding how you're standing really must be love. I'm talking true, I'm talking real, and I felt it in my heart and soul. You make me feel so good inside. You make me feel so good inside.
Now what is this that's happening? I don't even know you anymore. Oh, yeah. Changes moving through every day. Yeah. And I don't even know what we're fighting for.
Our bright days turn to sleepless nights. Our loving ways have turned to endless fights, and we can't seem to compromise. We try so hard to make things right. Yesterday, will erase all we turn. Can't we turn back? Hands on side. You are my love.
Welcome back, Weapon Crew. So we left off on the story of Raymond, and so we shall continue. Adam says that the music is perfect. There is no buffering. But for some reason, with my voice, that seems to buffer. I don't know. There's a mystery at large. Hello, Mr. Skywatcher. So great to see you. Oh my gosh, Love's Rest Stop. Those guys totally... Okay, as a rest stop, you should get really, really good deals as far as gas. But my trip to Texas and back to the Northern Panhandle... Oh my gosh. I think it was Valero and Speedway and other places that really had the best deal on gas, aka diesel, because we were in a diesel truck hauling stuff to Seymour, Texas, Seymour, Texas, right outside of Vernon, Texas, which is where Mr. Roy Orbison came from. Oh man, I love that guy. Anything you want, you got it. Alright, so let's continue with our story, Raymond. Over the years, Lodge became acquainted with other intelligent men who were exploring the same territory, and one of them, who was to be of lasting importance in his life, was a classic scholar, F. W. H. Myers. At the same time, impressive facts about telepathy were accumulating until, as interested students, Lodge and his friends heard in the early 80s from William James, brother of the novelist Henry James, who was professor of psychology at Harvard University. You know what, you guys? I'm going to pause for a second so I can grab my new spectacles. Oh my gosh, I could not believe how much cheaper gas and diesel was in Texas. Holy shnikes. I wonder if I can look it up. But here, let me grab my glasses real quick so I can read what I'm saying. See what I'm reading. I'm recording this. Where'd it go? I don't know if you guys know about the Gas Buddy app, but it's a pretty good one. Okay, so let's see. What is it here? So James reported that he had come across a remarkable medium named Mrs. Piper, who in a trance state seemed to get in touch with the spirits of the dead. In 1889, Mrs. Piper was invited to England, and Lodge had a sitting with her, his first ever with a trance medium, in which he was astonished to hear the well-remembered voice of an aunt who had died speak to him through the medium, reminding him in a very charismatic way and energetic manner that she had promised to come back if she could. From this sitting, Lodge got the strong impression that personality survives, but to exclude the possibility that Mrs. Piper had recovered some of his own memories by telepathy, he arranged a second sitting. At this, information was given about the early life of deceased relatives of yet an older generation, information which was subsequently confirmed by their surviving contemporaries. Lodge felt that a prima facie case for survival had been established, but he continued to look at further evidence objectively, bearing in mind other possible explanations of the extraordinary phenomenon which he witnessed or were reported by his friends. But other explanations were increasingly unsatisfactory, and over the years he personally became convinced that at least something of the human possibility survives death, and that communication is not easy, but it occurs. Then came August 1914. Lodge had 12 children, 6 boys and 6 girls, and his youngest son Raymond was at the time 25. With a marked gift for organization and engineering, he had been with a marked gift 2 months. Within a month, he had joined the South Lancashire Regiment for training as an officer, and by March 1915 was in the trenches of Flanders. Meanwhile, mediums had been receiving a mass of material purporting to come from Lodge's close friend Myers, who had died in 1901, which further substantiated survival. Now, in August 1914, Mrs. Piper, herself ignorant of classical literature, received a message allegedly from Myers containing a quotation from Horace, which, when correctly interpreted, spelt out a warning to Lodge that he would suffer a severe blow but would receive a comfort. 5 weeks later, on 14 September 1915, his son Raymond was killed in action. On 25 September, Lady Lodge, whose identity was unknown to the medium, was having a sitting with another person when the message was spoken by the medium in trance. "Tell father I have met some friends of his." Lady Lodge: "Can you give any name?" Answer: "Yes, Myers." 2 days after this, Lodge himself had an anonymous sitting with the same medium, Mrs. Leonard, who operated through a control believed to be the departed spirit of a young girl acting as intermediary for the conveyance of messages. This girl, who called herself Feta, said that a young man was with her and accurately described Raymond, though she only gave his name as R. R, she said, would be as a cross to his father, dark on one side, hashtag the suffering caused by his death, end quote, and light on the other. Because he is going to be a light that will help you to prove the world the truth. In other words, the truth of survival. From this time on, for many years, Sir Oliver and Lady Lodge and some of their children were in regular communication with Raymond through several trance mediums operating with their controls, and also at their home near Birmingham, when they were usually in touch through the table. A table round which they sat, tilting so many times for each letter of the alphabet and for yes and no. This sounds tedious, like a tedious method, but in time a very happy, intimate atmosphere is said to have developed in which the table almost acquired an identity. Beating time on its own, for instance, when the family sang songs, shaking apparently with laughter and jokes, tipping over, righting itself, and floating about the room, as well as answering through the alphabet. Through these and trance experiences in which mediums controls seem directly to convey Raymond's words, gestures, and manners of speech, and the surviving members of the family became convinced that he was alive, the evidence being of 2 kids. 1, intimate knowledge of past and also current affairs, and in some cases of facts unknown but subsequently corroborated. 2, an overwhelming impression of Raymond's surviving personality, not as a mere synthesis of family memories, let alone as a product of wishful thinking, but as something dynamic, independent, and unpredictable in its action. To the family, At any rate, any suggestion that all this might have some other explanation, or that all the evidence produced at sittings with mediums was the result of telepathy between the people involved, was past belief. So it was that, early in 1916, when thousands of families had been bereaved through the war, Sir Oliver Lodge was encouraged by Raymond to produce a book for their comfort and would show the evidence for survival. The result was published as Raymond, a new edition being produced in 1922 called Raymond, revised, which was enlarged to contain more recent material. Some of the evidence material can be summarized here, though it will be realized that the part under 2 above is mentioned not amenable to the family. An early and most striking piece of evidence of the living intelligence of Raymond concerned a group photograph taken in France a few days before he was killed. Until it was mentioned, no one in the family of its existence. The factual record, in which dates are important, runs as follows. Extract from anonymous sitting between Lady Lodge and a medium named Peters on 27 September 1915. The control is speaking. You have several portraits of this boy. One where he is in a group of other men. He is particular that I should tell you this. You see his walking stick. Being ignorant of the photo, neither Sir Oliver nor his wife followed up this clue until 29 November 1915, on which date they received a letter from a woman known to them, a Mrs. Cheeves, who was the mother of Raymond's battalion medical officer. This lady reported that her son had sent her copies of a group photograph in which Raymond appeared, and would the lodges like one? Lady Lodge replied with a grateful yes, but for some reason the photo did not reach her until after of 7 of December. Meanwhile, Sir Oliver had the brainwave of questioning Raymond about it before the copy arrived on the 3 December in a sitting with Mrs. Leonard. He was given the following information through Feda, her control. There were a dozen or more men in the photograph grouped close together, some standing, some sitting. Whose name began with B was rather prominent in the photo. Asked whether it had been taken out of doors, Raymond replied, practically, and to elucidate, this conveyed that there was a dark background with the vertical lines in it. Feda thought it might have been a shelter of some kind. When the photo arrived 4 days later, it showed 21 officers closely grouped, some standing, some sitting on a bench, and others cross-legged on the ground, against the background of a military hut, darkish on tone with upward sloping strips clearly visible on the roof, links of roofing felt. Raymond was cross-legged, his walking stick, the precursor of the swagger cane, lying across his feet, and the right hand of the officer behind him was resting on his left shoulder. Being in stronger sunlight than the others, there was an officer rather prominent, and his name was established from a key supplied by Mrs. Cheeves as Captain Boast. This was striking evidence, but more was coming almost concurrently. At a table session with Mrs. Leonard on 28 September, Raymond had been asked to name one of his brothers and gave Norman, which his parents believed they knew to be wrong until, on consulting the family, they found that Raymond used Norman as a kind of general nickname when playing hockey with his brothers. At the same sitting, he gave details of people who had met in France, unknown to sitters, which were subsequently corroborated. Two further examples of such evidence may be quoted. At another sitting, Sir Oliver, primed by his sons, asked Raymond what he associated with the word Argonauts, and the answer came, telegram. This drew a blank with the brothers, but Raymond's sisters remembered the connection well. On a holiday with his brothers, and Dad and Raymond had once sent a telegram home to say that all was well and had signed it Argonauts. At a sitting between his brothers Alec and Mrs. Leonard in December 1915, the question of singing cropped up, and Alec asked, "What did you use to sing?" The answer was confused, but sounded like Honolulu. This, too, was not understood till months later. An old song sheet was discovered at the family home dated Raymond 3rd, March 1904, on which he had altered the last verse in pencil to contain the words Honolulu Town. No one in the family knew about this, but on its discovery, a further test was arranged by some members. On 26 May 1916, a son, Lionel, and Nora, one of his sisters, were due to have a sitting in London with Mrs. Leonard, which in fact lasted from 11:15 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. On the same day, knowing that the London sitting had been arranged, Alec and two other sisters that the London sitting had been arranged, they were held in a 10-minute table sitting at home, starting at 12:10 p.m., at which Raymond was asked if he would be willing to convey a particular word through Miss Leonard's control to the party in London. The answer was vigorous. Yes. And the word was given as Honolulu. In the London sitting, meanwhile, amid significant pursuits, Raymond was talking through Fada about the family dog and then about a boy he had met called Ralph. Then suddenly, out of the blue, Fada said to Nora, "You could play." Nora, "Play what?" Fada, "Not the game of music." Nora, "I'm afraid I can't, Raymond." Fada was then heard to murmur to Raymond, "She can't do that." Then she said to Nora, "He wanted to know whether you play hulu Honolulu." Pause. "Well, can't you try?" Another pause, then Feta said, "He is rolling with laughter," which the sitters took to mean Raymond was highly delighted about something. As tests of survival after death against the background of serious questions concerning human destiny, such evidence may be thought trivial. But there is no real reason why we should expect earth-shaking revelations from someone just because he is in another world, and small incidents at least offer evidence which can be examined. At any rate, the record of signings given to Raymond Revised seems to show that some entity was eager to partake in such tests with the object. One feels of satisfying a healthy skepticism, removing barriers to intercourse, and finally revealing himself as indeed the living spirit of the lodge's beloved son. After a time, the family got into yet closer touch, and one is moved to read, for instance, of an emotional occasion when Alec was sitting alone with Mrs. Leonard, and Raymond seemed to possess the medium directly, speaking to his brother in his own voice and clasping him with his own hands. At the same time, there is indeed for caution. In his book, Lodge compares communication of this kind of vagaries of two inexpert telegraphists passing messages through family apparatus, and Raymond himself often referred to the difficulties of getting through without interference or seepage from the subconscious minds of medium control or sitters. In one case, not connected with Raymond, but reported in the book, a medium received a mass of departed spirit, only to find later that the person was alive in this world, and the details, all of them correct, had been obtained without his conscious awareness. As to how this happened, one can answer by telepathy. But as that is only the name we give to an unpredictable, obscure, though potent aspect of extrasensory perception, that leaves us almost as much in the dark as before. One lesson is clear: to seek advice from the departed, however strong the bond of love, is ill-advised and may be dangerous. For the same reasons, it is necessary to be skeptical about descriptions given in seances of life in another world. Raymond gave some of those, with details of which readers would form their own opinions, though the plausible suggestion did emerge that death is more like changing a suit of clothes than donning a garment of light, and the transition brings wider spiritual possibilities rather than an immediate and automatic enlargement of personality or awareness. So, this certainly sounds more likely than a sudden leap from earth to heaven, but without means of verification, we cannot judge its truth, and Raymond only purported to speak of what he himself had experienced. Other evidence tending to prove survival is touched on in Raymond Revised, and one piece, known as the Cross Correspondence, is particularly striking. Myers became well acquainted in his lifetime with the pitfalls of physical research, and some years after his death, he indicated through a medium who practiced automatic writing that he had devised a means to accumulate or circumvent them. Over a period of 12 years, there were then dictated to no less than 8 mediums working in several countries, separate fragments of 8 mediums working in learned puzzle on themes of classical literature, and it's such a way that no one can portion it to be made sense on its own. When all the fragments were finally sent up to the Society of Psychical Research, it was found possible, with much labor and erudition, to fit them together into a coherent whole. The cross correspondences are still condiscarnate intelligence operating from another world, and one may well ask, if Myers did not dictate those fragments, who did? Perhaps even on this slight basis, we can now form some opinion as to the value of the Sir Oliver Lodge's book. We have already indicated the importance. Oh my gosh. Sorry, there's a bug flying around me. It shows that human beings in this world may be much more interdependent and intimately linked than hereinthrough imagined, and are able very specifically to minister to each other's needs through the bond of love. Surely, these insights must be profoundly encouraged at a time when the human race is struggling amid intense confusion towards a sense of common destiny. Surely, they give new life to the central theme of Christianity and inspire us to seek a yet more solid foundation for the age-old dream of man, the dream of unity and wholeness within a divine and all-embracing purpose. Ooh, yeah. Alright, so we're going to the next chapter, which is of Saints and Church. Of Saints and Church. Stigmata. Christianity, for a religion so non-violent in its essence. Oh, wait a minute. What about the Spanish Inquisition and all this other bullshit? Seriously? Non-violent? Give me a break. Okay, going back to the story. It's remarkably blood-drenched in its evocations. Sadism is unthinkable. Masochism is unbridled. The immediate result of the birth of Christ was the massacre of the innocents. Thus, bloodshed early became established as the accompaniment for his life and for those of his followers for generations to come. The divine footsteps proved a bloody trail. While preaching his gospel of peace, Christ continuously spoke of blood. The blood of man! This is my blood that will be shed for you. Finally, he was subjected to the most appalling suffering and bloody death, leaving the legacy. Take up your cross and follow me. Take up your cross and follow me. The early Christians did not have long to wait. The bloodbath of suffering and persecution soon began and continued throughout the first centuries of the Christian Church. There emerged the most venerated being the martyr. Martyrdom became not just a fate to be born with resignation when inevitable, but one to be actually sought out. Thousands went happily to unspeakable deaths when often simple prudence would have suffocated or sufficed the weather, the storm. Times changed, and for reasons sometimes humanitarian, sometimes political, martyrdom became a glory not so easily attained. Christian Church and its people formed the status quo. In Europe, they saw to it that many a follower of other spiritual leaders were given the opportunity of a martyr's death. During the Middle Ages, Christians, for the most part, were free of suffering inflicted on them by others, but did not lose the notion that Christians should suffer simply because they were Christians. The tradition of self-imposed suffering was continued. Suffering by resignation to affliction, some practices encouraged fell a little, if at all, short of the bizarre. Not a few were given to kissing the sores of lepers, edifying, no doubt, for the aspiring saint, but a practice which must have been somewhat startling as it has been discussed of religious matters. Religious writers were prolific in discussing the religious matters, as was popular during the 12th century. Among the points debated were the words of St. Paul, "I bear the marks of the Lord Jesus in my body." Galatians 6:17. It was held by some that the saint had meant these words literally. Also, it was rumored that some Christian mystics had become so absorbed in contemplation upon the passion of Christ that they felt physical pain and bore marks corresponding to his wounds. Then, in 1224, a wonder occurred in the Christian world. Rumor became fact. Francis of Assisi, the founder of an order of friars, had a vision. When the vision faded, he bore on his hands and feet and side the marks of the wounds of the crucified Jesus Christ. Francis was born in Assisi in 1182. His father was a rich cloth merchant named Piero Bernardone. His mother was Mona Pica, a knight's daughter from Provence. He was christened Giovanni Francesco in the church of San Rufino. He had brothers and sisters, but little is known of them. So Francis's childhood was happy, free from want and unremarkable. As well as his native Italian, he was taught French by his Maja. A priest of San Giorgio taught him his alphabet, sums, and a little Latin. He was slow to learn to write, and throughout his life was never at ease with a pen. In early manhood, his father's wealth made it possible for him to indulge in a wayward mode of life common to rich young men at the time. Not all his pursuits were frivolous. In 2002 or 1202, he joined in the defense of Assisi when it was attacked by the forces of neighboring Uruguay. He was taken prisoner and was held captive for a year, suffering considerable privation. Regaining his freedom, a change came over Francis. He did not immediately forsake his former way of life, but grew increasingly sober-minded and giving a spending much time alone. He would disappear for weeks together without explanation. At nearby San Damiano, he came across a small tumble-down chapel. A hint of its former glory could be formed in a Byzantine crucifix hung over the altar. Splendid art enhancing squalid reality. Francis found his crucifix compelling. For hours he would kneel before it, riveted by the gentleness of the face which had endured so much. One morning, as he knelt at the hour of prime, the sun rose with an unimaginable brilliance. Walls should have afforded shade were rendered important or impotent. Francis closed his eyes, but the sun would not be shut out, just as it seemed that his brain itself would shatter. A voice spoke. "Restore my house." For Francis, there was no doubt Damiano. Forsaking his father's wealth, he left home and lived the life of a wandering beggar. When he found a church or chapel lying neglected, he repaired it himself or persuaded others either to help or to donate materials. Soon, he had gathered a group of followers, young men also seeking to imitate the life of Christ. Poverty became their ideal. They had no possessions. They lived entirely on charity. What little money they earned from their labors was given to the poor. As their numbers increased and they could be identified as community, Francis realized that it was necessary to gain papal recognition of their activities. They had started to preach as well as work, and to do the former without papal recognition could result in a change of heresy. In 1210, accompanied by 11 brothers, Francis traveled to Rome. They were befriended by Cardinal Ugolina, who pleaded their cause with the Pope, Innocent III, and pleading was indeed needed, for Francis declared that they had not come for papal approval. They already had approval from Christ, but from papal recognition. It is astonishing that he should have pulled rank on the Holy Father with a piece of bland self-assurance. However, Innocent was impressed by the obvious sincerity and goodness of the group and granted them permission to preach and form an order, which the world later came to know as Franciscans. By 1224, 2 years before the death of their founder, the Franciscans and their spiritual sisters, the Poor Clares, were well established. Michaelmas Lent from 15 August, Assumption Day to 29 September. He was accompanied by brothers Leo, Angelo, and Maceo. On the southern side of Mount Verna, Francis drew apart from the others to a small cave. Brother Leo was to bring his migrations a little bread and some vegetables, and even these every day. He embarked on a period of fasting, prayer, and contemplation upon the Passion of Christ. Oh my goodness, I'm not going to be able to finish the story. I gotta find my highlighter. Where's my highlighter? At sunset on the 13th of September, he left the cave and kept vigil on the side of the mountain. At dawn on the morning of the 14th, the feast of the exaltation of the cross, he turned his face eastwards. The sun rose, and San Damiano-like brilliance. Exalted by the moment, he saw a vision of seraph flying towards him. The angels' 6 wings were outspread and shone brighter than the sun. The apparition drew close and hovered above him. He could see the tips of the seraph's wings were nailed to a cross. Could you imagine seeing that? Holy shnikes. So, ecstatic, Francis felt his body racked with excruciating pain. Pain such as Christ himself must have endured. As the vision faded, the pain subsided. Francis looked down. His hands bore wounds as mutilated in the same manner. His left side bore a gash as though a lance had been piercing through it to determine death. The stigmatism of St. Francis is considered to be the first case of its kind, although the notion of such a possibility is not unknown. Certainly, his is the first that was in any way documented. If no one had borne the stigma since, we would wonder if the accounts were not the testimony of well-meaning but overzealous followers. However, Francis was the first of what was to amount to over 300 cases, the latest of whom have died within the last decade. There has always been someone within living memory claiming or at least reputed to bear the stigmata. Dr. Embert Gorman-Beyer, whose book on stigmatism was the first published in Paris in 1873, gives as 321 the number of known cases. Of these, 41 are men and 280 are women, a staggering proportion of 7 women and 1 man. Could you imagine that? He gives the geographical distribution as follows: Italy 229, France 70, Spain 33, Germany 33, Belgium 15, Portugal 113, Switzerland 5, Holland 5, Hungary 3, and Peru 1. The majority of cases were among members of religious orders. Dr. Embert Gorbayer states that in the 18th century, only 2 cases of a recorded 30 were lay people. In the 19th century, there were 19 religious, 10 lay. Could you imagine? Holy snacky, shabab, shabab, shabab. Oh, well, it sounds like everything is working out good, so that's good. So the proportion of 7 women and 1 man must surely indicate that the emotional constitution of women is more likely to produce the conditions necessary for stigmatism than that of men. Saint Teresa of Avila, herself a stigmatist, constantly warned of the dangers of women dedicated to a religious life being prone to hysterical manifestations. She wisely held that if a nun showed signs of losing the run of herself, she should be given some good hard work to take her mind off of things. So, I'm so grateful that I was able to be with you guys here tonight, and even though I didn't want to go to Texas, I went there, and I was able to go to Vernon, Texas, which is where Mr. Roy Orbison is from. Anything you want, you got it. Anything you need, you got it. Anything at all, you got it, baby. Ooh, I love that song. I can just still hear it going in my head. But anywho's, thank you so much again for being my guest tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. Thank you to our friends on We Are Paradox Media's KPNL Radio, Facebook, Twitter, Periscope, iHeartRadio, and wherever else you may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. I'm so grateful for you. Thank you for listening and tuning in, and I can't wait to do it again next weekend when it's a surprise. You will see next weekend what is going to happen next weekend, because I cannot tell you right now. Don't forget, we are all in this together. Together, we can make the world a little better. And together, my friends, we are Paradox Media, because without you, there is no us. So, you can join us for the Skype after party, but I'm not even sure if I'm going to do that after happenings last night. Oh, Mr. Morris, he said, I like the sea ghosties. I like them too, and they weren't too vicious. Like, some of them actually helped to guide and steer the ships as the son and father slept, and there were so many awesome things happening. Until next time, nighty night, love and light. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend and week, and I will see you back here, same time, same place. I'd like to thank our sponsors. So our musical sponsor is Mr. Roy Washington. We also have financial sponsors and volunteers. We got Mr. Jim Morris of the Scottish Isles. We have Mr. Dale Elson, Mr. Kevin McDoodle, and Miss Mia Savage. You guys are awesome. Weekday host, well, we don't have that anymore.